Well, let's go ahead and get started here. And first of all, thank you for joining us at this training, because it is the first time doing this, and really, interested in getting your feedback, over the next month here on the 4 modules. Hopefully you can make it to all those as we kind of build this training around future intelligent leadership. And it is kind of a new concept that we're kind of proposing out there, and we're just now starting to build the knowledge base around it, but also the practical application of it, right? So the feedback's really important for us. And so I'm going to be using PowerPoint kind of as the way to frame all this. And we'll also be doing a little bit of interactive stuff as well with each other to explore some new ways of thinking and ideas. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and this is being recorded, just so you know as well. Let me share my screen, and okay, can everybody see this okay?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Great. Okay, so as you know, this is Haku Global. One of the goals is to accelerate leadership future intelligence and really explore what that is and what that means. And this is the Future Intelligent Leadership Foundation course. It's something we've been working on for a while, and really, slowly putting it out there. And part of it's been built also around a podcast that we've been running called the Future Intelligent Leadership Podcast. We've had 30 something episodes already, and growing audience, but also a lot of unique insights and information that's coming out of those dialogues. So I encourage you to, if you haven't listened to it, I encourage you to look into it. And several people have already been on the podcast that are here today. And this is module 1, right? So the idea behind this first module is just give you an overview of what leadership, future intelligence, and future readiness could look like from this more neuroscience perspective. And the focus today is to develop a proprietary neuroscience-based future intelligence cognitive architecture, understand what that means and what that looks like, to investigate the cognitive and emotional intelligence required for strategic foresight, and to provide an overview of future intelligence design canvas, which could be a bridge for practical application of this information. So I'd like to start, though, just briefly, if everyone could do a quick introduction, just because not everybody knows each other, and just 3 things, your name, what your work is right now, and then one thing you might hope to take away from this, even if you don't know exactly what you're supposed to get out of this training, but what's one thing you'd like to get out of it? And I'll start with Catherine, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Catherine Green. My work is leadership change management, and I have a focus on aging workforce issues. One takeaway is to try to understand how to concretize a lot of what I've been talking to Tyler about for probably over a year, I guess. Yep.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Cindy.
Cindy Batchelor. I am out of Cincinnati, Ohio. I am an HR director for a company called Moats Corporation that specializes in synthetic turf fields and supplies. So kind of a cool thing there. I have always been passionate about people and development and dynamics and all of those. Just, my goal for this class is to not only hopefully learn something for myself, but also it's always about how do I give to others. So incorporating that into this organization or other organizations that I'm working with.
Thank you, Cindy. Hilde.
Hi guys, my name is Hilde. I work as a strategic improvement director at Visa. So there we are, my team's responsible for solving large cross-functional business problems. And so a lot of that is process, but a lot of it is also change management and influencing people and see how we can do things differently. And my takeaway from today, there are many things actually, but I think aside from how I could potentially bring this into the workplace, I'm also really curious as to how this can enrich my personal journey, where I'm looking to, find a different career and get inspiration for that really.
Great. Thank you, Hilde. Aurora.
Hi, everyone, it's Aurora here. I'm based in Hong Kong. I'm an Australian citizen, but I've lived here for 15 years. I work as an organizational consultant. I specialize in leadership development, so I do a lot of coaching and facilitation work. My background is in tech, so I take a lot of the experience from my years at Microsoft and the Vodafone Group and Optus in Australia. One takeaway I would like for today is just to understand, just building from the questionnaire, the link between foresight, innovation, and strategy. I was really intrigued by that. So hopefully we can touch on that today.
Gabriel.
Hi, everybody. My name is Gabriel Fernandez. I'm currently a postdoctoral research scientist at the Translational Research Institute for Metabolism and Diabetes in Orlando, Florida. So what we look at is a variety of different mitochondrial functions between obesity and type 2 diabetes, as well as the applications of exercise science and physiology towards the intervention of those diseases. We use highly advanced analytical and diagnostic techniques to be able to analyze individuals with diabetes and obesity. So it's a really interesting place to work at. And one of the things I really want to take away from this whole thing is that, like a lot of people have said, not only personal development, but what can we do in terms of innovation? I think part of being a scientist is always looking towards the future. What is predicting what is going on, predicting what is happening at a certain level. And so being able to cultivate that technique and maybe other applications towards, grander scales could also help my future and professional development as well.
Thanks, Gabriel. And Adam?
Hi. So most of my work has been in affective neuroscience, studying preferences and motivation. I've recently, or I don't know how recently, been moving more into consciousness studies, currently studying that at Johns Hopkins with respect to psychedelics. I'm ultimately interested in building rich models of agency and free will and different forms of consciousness and self-consciousness. And today I would like to learn about the nature of leadership and foresight because many reasons, but one is I think the same principles apply without and within. And so just seems like one of the more important things you can study.
Great, thanks, Adam. Okay, so let's just start. Let's see, here we go. Okay, so when it comes to thinking about the future, a lot of times what our brain is going to do is it's going to look for past content, text, or information to really frame the future possibilities, right? So when we think about or imagine futures, it's not free from the past, and it can be limited by the past or supported in the past. And the past can also come together in novel ways to create and imagine new things in the future. And for most people, though, if you look at it, a lot of our future framing is going to be developed from the past. And there's been lots of studies around like episodic memory or episodic foresight, where we're looking at past experiences to help develop future possible experiences. And one of the things they find out is that episodic memory and foresight are typically integrated in healthy individuals, right? There's this kind of continuity of experience from the past into the present. And a lot of times that episodic memory is really important and essential for developing the episodic futures, experiences that we could have in the future. However, and this is important because it really shows a level of like trust, right? Competency and character when you can think from the past into the future in very coherent, integrated, and logical ways. And the problem is, though, is that it's not necessary that or I wouldn't say the problem, but one of the things to think about is it's not necessary to have the episodic memory to have episodic foresight, right? So although they are integrated traditionally, doesn't mean they have to be, okay? And there's some interesting research that's been done out there, especially with children with, for example, autism, and finding out that they have the ability to have to gather information and have episodic experiences and memories of those, but they can have challenges with developing episodic foresight or futures. And at the same time, though, there's information that shows you can still develop episodic futures, imagining futures without really strong episodic memory of the past, right? And interesting, if we dive into the neuroscience, which we're not going to do too much right now, but we look at the hippocampus, that tends to be the place where we find this ability for recall and also future event construction. And one of the interesting things, though, about the hippocampus is that there is the left side of the brain, or the left side of the hippocampus, is really responsible for, or one of the things it's responsible for, is for recall and future event construction. But the right side is only responsible for future event construction. It doesn't have the recall section, right? So what typically happens, though, is we're having a recall of a past event, then constructing the future, but maybe it's not necessary. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to try a little experiment, okay, and see if we can imagine futures, create episodic foresight without episodic memory, and what happens, okay? So to do that, what I want to do is we're going to break up into groups of just two. I'm going to put you into breakout rooms, okay? And just listen carefully because it might sound a little bit strange what we're going to do. What we're going to do is you're going to get into groups of two, and you're going to pick one person to be partner A and one person B. And partner A is going to go first, okay? And what partner A is going to do is they're going to ask a question about the other person. The question is, what's the future I see for this person? Okay. Now, you don't know the person, or maybe you know them a little bit. And what you want to do is see what comes to mind as you ask that question, right? And so you're going to ask the question and you're going to answer it, right? So for the first part of the exercise, if you're partner B, you're basically just going to listen. So partner A is going to ask the question, what's the future I see for my partner B? And then they're going to start sharing what they see, okay? Now, we're just going to be making it up because you don't have an episodic past or memory of the past to really pull in to create the episodic foresight or future for them. And we just want to see what this experiment does for you and kind of what kind of outcomes you get from it. Does this make sense? Does anybody have any questions about how this is going to work? Make sense? Okay. So I'm going to break you out into breakup groups of two. And let's see. Great. And I'm going to join Gabriel. So here we go. Oh, okay. All right, Gabriel. Just 1 second. Let me send everybody a message here. Okay. So this make sense on how to do this?
Yeah. How's it going?
Yeah, good. How you doing, Gabriel?
Pretty good. Pretty good.
All right. I can go first. I'll be partner A first.
All right. Sounds good.
And then let me set a little timer here so I don't get carried away. All right. Okay. So what's the future I see for Gabriel? All right. First thing I'm seeing is I'm seeing it's like a magic carpet.
Okay.
It's like flying in the clouds on a magic carpet ride kind of thing, right? And I don't know what that means, but that's just kind of what I'm seeing. And you're pulling on that carpet and just kind of floating. Big perspective, right? Things seem smooth and easy on that ride, right? It's not a little bumpy just because you're on it. It's not very stable.
Some turbulence, yeah.
Yeah, but it's smooth, right? It's not doing any drastic ups and downs. And I'm also seeing just kind of like a cone or spherical shape, and it's like some place maybe you visit or some concept you're thinking of, but it's got it's like got a cone, a pyramid kind of idea behind it. I don't know if that means like a peak in some way.
Okay, that's interesting.
It's kind of like you're down at the bottom, but you're looking up at it, right? That's the idea behind it. Yeah. Okay.
That's pretty good. No, that's pretty cool.
What'd you get from that?
Um, I definitely vibe with the magic carpet ride thing. You know, that's almost like a point I want to be in life. Like, yeah, you know, it might be bumpy, but we're smooth sailing. But I always envision the takeoff of the magic carpet to be a little difficult as well. You know, like it takes some time. You know, you're perfecting your craft, you're perfecting the carpet, you're making sure, you know, it's got this, you know, everything that it needs to have so that you have that smooth ride.
Cool.
So it's
All right.
yeah, it made me think of that. Yeah.
All right. All right, go ahead, give it a shot.
Okay, yeah. So for you, so it's really interesting. For you, so what future do I envision for Tyler? So I was thinking about this, and the first thing that came to mind is a mountain, actually. But you are actually at the top and looking down from it. So it was interesting that you gave me the reverse perspective. And I also see the beach, like a very serene environment, like you just relaxing, enjoying the view, watching the sunrise, and just enjoying it. You know, like that's the future I see for you. And another thing is just happy, like just very happy with everything that's going on.
Perfect.
So what'd you take from that?
Perfect. That's great. Yeah, that's yeah, definitely. I think I'm a little bit in that space too, and wanting to be there more. Um, and yeah, I think it's good acknowledging maybe that I am more on the top of the mountain, and then what that means for me. You know,
Yeah.
especially as a future. You know, because if you're already at the top of the mountain in some way, what's your next steps?
What's your next step?
Right
Yeah.
from
Is
there.
there another mountain?
Is there
You
another
know,
mountain, or are you just
yeah,
content
or
up
you're
there?
just content up there? Yeah.
Yeah,
No, it's a
exactly.
very good point. Yeah.
So interesting to see. Let me broadcast a message to everybody. Tell them 2 more minutes. How's everything else going?
Really well, really well.
Good.
Work's going great. You know, just really busy. Had to rebuild a water trap for a gas chromatograph. That was really interesting. Yeah, you know, just crazy stuff that happens in labs. So, but we're doing really well. We had a grant cycle that unfortunately fell through. You know, last minute we decided to do it, and then last minute we also decided, you know, maybe this just wasn't the best time to do it as well. So you know, learning experiences all around, and I'm just really grateful to be in that position, to be learning everything that I am, and you know, developing all the skill sets for not only my job, but you know, for the future, to be a director, to be a manager, to be a CSO. So it's a really interesting place to develop. It's very small, but everybody's really collaborative. So
Yep.
I'm really excited about it. How
Yeah,
about you? How's
good.
how's so far?
Good. Yeah, I just finished an MBA program. I was going to say
Oh
maybe
yeah,
that's
yeah,
something to
yeah.
look at for you. It's an online program, so it kind of fits
Oh
your
yeah.
schedule. Um, but you know, especially with your kind of goals of getting into the more director leadership space, that might be nice to have. I mean, if you have, I have a friend. He has an MBA and PhD, and he went on
No, it
to
helps. It does help.
yeah, he went on to run a big what was it, a protein development company, and
Oh,
he sold
nice.
it twice.
Oh yeah, we were talking
He's
about
done
that
well for
one.
himself, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that I think maybe looking at an MBA program would be kind of interesting for you to find one that also fits in, you know, your work schedule and everything.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I've been looking at a few different things here and there. You know, I was really interested in data science and software engineering for a bit as well. You know, just kind of blending the two skill sets that I have, and my passions for computer programming, but an MBA too. You know, just that would really help,
Yep.
especially like you're saying for higher level.
I'm bringing everybody back in here.
Sweet.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what people get from that. I've done this with the executives. It's really interesting to see how they respond.
Yeah, like how do executives see their employees, you know, for the future? You know,
Yeah.
is that part of the company, not part of the company?
Yeah.
A lot of personal and maybe, you know, social factors at play.
Yep. Okay, just a couple people are coming back in now. Okay. Okay, everybody's back in. Did everybody have enough time for that? Okay. Who wants to share something they got from that experiment?
I can share.
Sure.
Catherine and I were together. It was pretty hard to pull from, and we didn't have anything, and so I found myself pulling from like what motivates me and drives me,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to like create a storyline for her based on my own motivations.
Yep. Yeah, that tends, I've done this experiment many times with different types of groups, and that tends to happen. What we find, people find out that they're really pulling from what's inside them and their story, and maybe trying to see how it could apply to the other person. Yeah. What else? Anybody else have anything else to share?
Yeah, I think I noticed in our group, and I was with Ralph, that I think I was really kind of making things up, right? So, and it all looked very rosy and sunny. But I think when we turned around, what I noticed is that Ralph, if you don't mind me sharing, really kind of went back to the things that I had said in the introduction, to build on that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a slightly different angle, I suppose, where mine was probably a lot less accurate because I just made it up. But yeah.
Great. I'm curious, did Ralph, did Hilde get anything correct that she made up, or did it seem correct in any way?
Ralph, you're on mute.
Oh, yeah.
No, we can't hear you, Ralph.
Ralph, you're on mute.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, actually, she hit it pretty close. I mean, I am looking for a place in the sun and the sand to go sit around, and I am doing some intellectual pursuits, as you know, Tyler, and I am working on an outline of my own book. So yeah,
great.
Oh, that was not too bad then.
yeah.
Interesting, right? Anyone else? One last person want to share anything? Yeah, Adam.
So it was just, so at first I tried like some sort of analogy to my own experience, but then I was thinking, I don't know her well enough. So instead I to like know if the analogy would apply. So instead I was like, okay, so how do I feel from listening to her, and then how could I see myself reacting in different circumstances? And then I drew like analogies to other people, and then like a scenario kind of constructed itself. It was still kind of vague and unspecified, but like it kind of worked. I think it did. And just that process was interesting. And the other interesting thing was what was envisioned for me was actually in a way somewhat surprising to me, but not off, but actually like seeing scenarios in ways and framings that could be something to live into, but just for various reasons wasn't necessarily the way I was viewing it. And I guess one more quick thing is it's maybe related, this could be a somewhat loose association, but the connection between like memory and reward or value or motivation, and the way like what we think is shaped by how it feels. And there's like this like constant shaping of like what we do and don't like envision. And so like the hippocampus, like you like pointing that as like the center of it. Like I'm increasingly like actually studying that system for exactly the reasons you're describing. And one more quick detail is actually even like, I thought it was really interesting what you said about like even like the brain differences on the sides, because that's actually also reflected in the brain's dopamine system. So it's motivation
rewards.
Yeah, so it's like one's like more this like counterfactual future on the right, that's like this possibility, and then the left is that and the more specific, concrete, grounded in events that happened. And so that's actually reflected across all these systems in alignment. So
interesting.
Anyways, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, so let me just some things that I've seen people get out of this in the past when I've done this experiment. One is there is kind of this pragmatic optimism, or sometimes it's not even pragmatic, right? There's this optimism about other person's future that's there, really, and they like to make up futures that are positive, feel good, right? But what's interesting is a lot of times when we do it for our own future, right, or our own organization, it's not always positive, right? A lot of times we might default to the negative first, right? Or we might see a positive and say we can't do that, right? That's impossible. Let's be more pragmatic. But there tends to be more optimism around it when we're doing it for somebody else. The other one is that this idea of, is imagination accurate? When we imagine things, can it be accurate? And I think some people showed that, yeah, there can be some accuracy there for some reason. We don't know why, but we can kind of make things up for somebody else, and it can make sense. I mean, and if we really think about it, we're always just making up the future anyways, right? There's no rule book for the future. Now, stress can impair the imagination. Right? And what's interesting too is actually the hippocampus is related to conflict avoidance, right? So when we get into situations where we could create conflict, we start to potentially shut down some of the hippocampal activity, that ability to imagine things. So you can see in a situation like this where all of a sudden you want to say something, but you might think, well, that's not going to be accurate. That might make the person feel bad, or might make me feel bad. I don't want that conflict. So let's just not talk about that thing, right? Or let's not imagine that thing. But also the stress will impair the ability to imagine, right? You'll have to pull more from that episodic memory than episodic foresight when you're in stressful situations. And then finally, if you keep imagining, I think if you keep doing this, like if we got into groups and you did it again with somebody else and then somebody else, and we keep doing it, we'll get better at it, right? We'll get more comfortable, and we'll start to think of new things, and then we'll allow new things to emerge, right? So when I've done this with groups and maybe we do like 5 minutes and maybe they're imagining the future of their organization, instead of making it even a little less personal, they get more and more and more ideas, right? Allow new things to emerge. So the question is though, in complex and uncertain exponential change, is the past the best source of content for the future, right? So although we typically rely on that episodic memory to create episodic foresight, is that the best option? And there's a few things to think about. This is a Cynefin framework, Dave Snowden's work, if you're familiar with that. And, one of the things that, in complexity, we really have to let things emerge, right? In a simple environment, things are predictable. We can pull on the past, right? And we can create futures. It's not going to be a problem. But when we're in places where states and environments where it's really disruptive, very complex, the past isn't necessarily going to serve us. We have to see what emerges in the present or in the future. Now, one of the things that we might say we want to look to is we want to look to expertise, right? We want experts to help us out to be more future ready. But at the same time, there's been some interesting experiments out there. I don't know if you're familiar with the gorilla experiment. Has anybody seen that one with radiologists? They took a group of radiologists, they're experts in radiology, and they stuck a gorilla inside the film, right? And in the brain, right? So you have this brain they're looking at, and there's a gorilla in there. And it's not a small gorilla. I mean, it's probably an inch size gorilla. You can obviously see it if you see the picture. But what happened was 80-something% of the radiologists completely missed it when they were asked what's wrong with this image. They completely missed the gorilla because their brain is not trained to look for gorillas in brains, right? So when we go to experts and we look for information, from the past to create the future, we have to be aware of this challenge that experts are going to see from their lens, their view of the past. It's going to inform their future, and it's going to work in situations where, it's not complex, there's not disruption. But in those complex, uncertain, exponentially changing environments, they might not be the best source of information. And so when we ask that question of, is the episodic memory, is that past the best source of information for the future? The answer was, well, let's divert away from traditional foresight training, which focuses on social science and methodology. And let's explore more of a future intelligence grounded in strategic neuroscience-based strategic foresight, right? Grounded more in the neurosciences and cognitive social behavior, and see what we come up with. And so why? Well, because brains and bodies are the embedded context from which we think, feel, act, initiate and explore and build futures, right? So if we look at neuroscience, I think one of the more interesting things to me is this idea of what happens in the very short term and how that might also influence the long term of strategic foresight. And what I like to call this is I like to call this the hello effect. Okay. So in the short term, there's 3 things that happen within like 3 seconds, maybe even faster. 3 neurons fire. There's 2 options that we have to choose from. And really there's one goal in mind. So hello effect, 3, 2, 1 in 3 seconds. And let's dive a little deeper into what that looks like. So the 3 neurons fire. So basically the way I like to think about this is when we meet somebody, or we even think about meeting a new future, right? Is these 3 neurons are going to fire. The first one is a mirror neuron, and it's going to ask, what state is this person in? Or we could even say, I think we can expand it and say, what state is this future, right? Meaning by state, we're meaning what kind of physiology they have. Is it an aggressive physiology? Is it a friendly physiology? What's the context in which they're operating in, right? Within their own body. And then what happens is spindle neurons will fire. And what these neurons do, they wrap from the frontal part of the brain all the way to the back part. And they're looking at, does this state, emotional state of the person, does it really align with the context that we're in, right? So for example, if I'm in a business context and I see someone walk in and they look really mean and angry, their state is kind of out of context. And maybe I don't want to shake their hand. But I think we can think same thing with the future. Like, okay, there's a certain state of that future that we're looking at. Is it aligned with the context in which we're interested in creating? And then finally, there's oscillation neurons. And these are neurons that actually judge whether we can move with this person, physically move with them, work together or not, right? So we can also think about this in the context of the future. Like, is it a future I can work with? Or, can I move in that future or not? And so these 3 neurons are firing and really starting to frame this overall context of the interaction, right? And it's really important for survival, right? Because we have to be able to quickly size up, what's this other person? Are they a threat or not? And that comes to number 2 of the hello effect is we have 2 options, right? To choose. Is it us or them, right? Are they one of us or one of them? And this is a very quick response that happens. So a lot of things when it comes to diversity and inclusion practices. We have to be aware of this very primitive trigger in the brain to create groups and tribes, right? Because it's very essential for survival. If I immediately think this person's part of us, then the way I treat them is very different than if they're part of them, right? If they're them, they could be a threat. Maybe not a threat, but once they become in that category, I'm not as trusting. I'm more skeptical of them. And I think we can do this with futures as well, right? We can immediately get a picture of a future and say, is that future part of us or part of them? Do I fit into that future or not? And then finally, the one goal. Really, the brain wants to create a future together, right? It wants one future for everybody, I think. It's more efficient and effective, okay? Although we've kind of gone through this process of really, differentiating whether someone's in the right context or not, and whether they're part of us or them, we really want to find the pathway to make one future. The brain prefers trust, collaboration, and connection. That's just more effective and efficient for survival. Interesting research around like prisoner's dilemma, where basically you can choose to cooperate or choose to kind of take advantage of people in situations, and you go back and forth in different scenarios on, would you collaborate in this scenario or would you kind of take advantage of somebody? And what they found out is long term, the people who do best in the prisoner dilemma games are ones who do cooperative to start with. They collaborate always. And they also forgive first if somebody does something kind of not cooperative to them, right? Now, and that wins out in the long run. Now, at the same time, of course, you only use payback in the prisoner's dilemma scenario if the other person continues to stop cooperating with you. So I think this shows that the brain really wants to find cooperation first. It wants to forgive if people don't try to build the future together. And I think in the short term, this hello effect is really kind of dominating not only our initial interactions with people, but also our sense of the future as well. Okay. And I think from a leadership perspective, this hello effect is very important, right? It's how are you creating the right state to align with the right context so that people put you in the them category, right? So that you can really collaborate and create a future together. And you have to realize this is happening very fast. You can, for example, you meet somebody, if you're a sports fan, for example, and you meet somebody who has a jersey or a hat on from the other team, you immediately put them in the them category, not the us category. And there's really nothing you can do about it. You now frame the whole interaction, the starting point of if we can collaborate or not from that perspective. And you might get to know them better, but at the same time, in the back of your mind, you might always be thinking, yeah, but they're not really one of us, right? They're on the wrong team. So this short-term framing, I think, very important to understand, because it's determining the futures that we prefer, and also the people that we prefer to create the future with. Now, in simple, predictable, and static environments, for example, a sports team, a sporting event, it makes sense, right, to maybe put people in the them category to create that kind of rivalry, and the rules are very clear, right? And we also know that once we're out of that context, everything else can change. However, when we get into very complex, uncertain, exponentially changing environments, for example, in a pandemic, which we're in, then it becomes a different situation. The environment is much more chaotic. It's much easier to create tribes and put people in categories, but there's no rules for when that's going to end, right? And so this short-term thinking can really limit our long-term framing. And the question is, like, how do we overcome the limitations of this short-term foresight to engage more long-term thinking? And at Haku Global, we think it's this idea of future intelligence. And there is collective intelligence, emotional intelligence, cognitive intelligence, adaptive intelligence, lots of different types of intelligence out there. We know that emotional intelligence has been gaining interest over the years, even though it's still not fully widespread. It's not fully been adopted in business, but it's definitely growing over the years. But we think future intelligence is the next kind of evolution of really getting leadership smart about the futures. And it does have embedded in it emotional intelligence and cognitive intelligence and collective intelligence, because it's all about being able to create the future in some way and build futures with people. And so, kind of as a definition of future intelligence, we see this as the capability to strategically explore, accurately anticipate, and intentionally shape futures for the self and others. This might include like critical thinking about future developments, about possible opportunities and risks, exploring alternative futures and scenarios, clearly defining and designing desired futures, understanding how present action influences future outcomes, utilizing future intelligent tools and methodologies, and motivating the inner and outer context to guide collective efforts for actualizing the future. And maybe a more simpler way to think about it is we see this within three kind of categories, or three kind of parts to future intelligence. The first is the cognitive and emotional capacity for foresight. So one of the big things that we see in the foresight space, like I was referring to earlier, is there's a real focus on the social sciences. Right? So the starting point is, how do we act as people in societies? And then let's start to develop and frame the future from that perspective. And we think if you look at the science, you really need to start at the brain, at the level of the brain first. And that's going to help you to understand how you can develop the cognitive and emotional capacity that's necessary to have really long-term foresight that also creates alignment in yourself and the organization. Another part would be tools and methodologies that really enhance future intelligence. And the final part would be being able to harness collective intelligence for collaborative futures. And there's a growing research around this idea of collective intelligence and what that looks like. And we think it's a core component for future intelligence. So why future intelligence? So, I mean, don't we have enough intelligence out there? Or, is this going to be practical, or is it just going to be theory, right? That we think about things but do nothing with it. Well, studies show that future prepared firms outperform competition, right? If you're familiar with Robrecht's work, and I have some links here at the end of this that I can share with you, but 33% more profitability, 40% increase in stakeholder performance, 200% increase in capitalization growth when companies have more future focus or prospection that's going on in the organization. So it's a very practical reason to be more future intelligent. Surveys show that leadership's not prepared for the future. So leadership doesn't feel prepared for the future. They need training around this. They need help. Okay. 71% of firms admit their leadership is not prepared for the future, and they see that as one of the leading business risks. Right. So my question is, like, old training models and paradigms, are they just not working, or are organizations not doing the future preparedness that they need to be doing? The third is short-termism is leading to missed opportunities and increased risk for disruption from paradigm shifts. So 43% of leaders state that their companies lack the innovation because they prioritize short-term financial results over long-term value and growth-driven objectives, right? And this is a big issue. It's really interesting. If you think about it, most leadership and most firms are kind of stuck within this short-term space because they're measuring their success on quarterly goals. And then when things are going well, they don't need the foresight. They can just keep focusing on that short term. But when things get challenging, well, it's already too late to do foresight. So they have to focus on the short term again. And so they don't usually have an incentive to kind of think into the long term and do the foresight that is required to handle the disruption that they could be facing in the future. Interesting book, The Future Leader, by Jacob Morgan. He says that thinking like a futurist is a top skill of future CEOs. So he interviewed over 1,000 CEOs, and they said the top most important skill is to be able to think like a futurist for the next generation of leadership. So that's very interesting. And finally, the own research that we've done at Haku, doing interviews, giving presentations at conferences and getting feedback, we really see a growing demand for this idea of future intelligence. Right? And I think it's important to understand that we're talking about the initial starting point of future intelligence is from the neuroscience perspective, because you'll see is a growing kind of literature around future intelligence being this more technology focus, right? Aspect. And there's actually some conferences out there called Future Intelligence Conference. It's a very heavy tech conference, and technology is a part of future intelligence. But I think the key that we really want to highlight is that we want to start with this idea of the embedded brain and body and the neuroscience component that's going to inform us on how to really move into the future strategically. So let's look at a little bit more of what neuroscience of future intelligence could look like. Oh, wrong way. So a lot of this work, kind of the foundation of our work, comes from two people, Bernard Bars and Dehaene. And what they looked at is they were looking at the brain and what happens in the brain consciously and unconsciously when it tries to manage complexity, uncertainty, and exponential change. And Bars really came up with this idea initially. His book is really great book he has out there, pretty detailed and dense. So, but he talks about this idea of a global workspace of the brain. So the idea is that we have this brain, and it has certain systems that are feeding into this one space that then allows a future frame to emerge. So let's look at what that could look like. So the way I like to look at this and think about it, there's many ways you can. He actually uses the analogy of a theater. I like to think of it as a blackboard, right? So think of the brain as like this empty blackboard. And again, this is like happening in milliseconds, right? That all this stuff that we're going to talk about. But what happens is you have this blank brain, and then you have an experience or a context, and it's going to start to trigger things, right? It's going to trigger content because I need to make a choice or decision. And according to Barr's work, there's 5 main areas where we get this content from. Past memories, right? We might get it from the sensations or perceptions we feel in the moment. We might get it from attention, where our attention is focused on, from past values or our evaluation process, and from what we're anticipating. Okay. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail about these, especially over the next 3 classes. But the idea is that these are triggered, and these systems are triggered, and the content is going to start to pour in from these systems. And I think one of the key things to think about is that how well we've developed these systems and our ability to access them consciously is going to influence what type of content we can access. So this information is going to start to flow in. All this content in the brain to help us make a decision. And it's not really hierarchical in any way. It's more just like a mash of ingredients that kind of just get put on this board. And then the brain has to make a decision from that. Okay. And the idea is they're all kind of collaborating, integrating, and competing at the same time for the dominant goal frame. They want to determine what the next steps are be, right? So for your example, if you have memories that are very dominant, for example, if you're triggered in a situation where maybe you were on stage and laughed at as a child, right? And that's a memory you have, and you get into a context where you're on stage, that memory might be very strong. It's going to pull in content to decide your future and say, hey, this is dangerous. Remember what happened last time? And if you haven't developed the other areas of content, then it's going to dominate and it's going to create the dominant goal frame. Okay. It's going to naturally emerge and it's going to start to frame everything we do next. Okay. Now, this dominant goal frame, of course, can be very long-term and it can also be very short-term, right? But typically it's happening every moment. So one way I like to think about it, if I, when I wake up in the morning and I tell my brain, hey, I want coffee, like all of a sudden that becomes my dominant goal frame. I don't know what content triggered that. Maybe it was my past memory of having coffee every morning, but that becomes my dominant goal frame. And then I just go do it, right? I don't think about all the next steps. I don't need to write them down and plan out where do I get the coffee beans from? How do I turn on the machine? Like I know how to do all that stuff instantaneously, right? Without effort. Okay. Because that dominant goal frame has all kinds of actions built into it now, right? So one way to think about this is if we already have dominant goal frames that are already out there within ourself or organization, they're going to kind of run on autopilot. They can be hard to change unless we introduce new content. But also when we want to create new dominant goal frames for ourself and organization, we want to make sure we get the best content, right? That really helps us determine, what we really want to focus on and what's next. So what's also interesting about this framework that they've been working on is that it is really been kind of fostered from this idea of really wanting to understand how to make better AI. So they're using this model to develop AI and I'll just understand intelligence in general. So if they're using that model for AI, I think we should probably start using it maybe for humans too, so we can have at least a leg up on them, right, in some capacity. Now, what this system does is it tries to account qualitatively for consciousness and unconscious brain processing, right? So we always have to remember that this is happening both on the conscious and unconscious level. And I think what we'd like to introduce is that you can start to consciously think about how to activate these systems and bring in the right content. The other thing that's important is that, like we just talked about, is it creates a neural avalanche, which basically starts to mobilize the entire body, entire brain, whether it be an individual or a team, around a certain goal frame, right? For example, when a red sports car zooms by, as the example Dehan gives, the whole brain, our whole experience starts to mobilize around what that means and what that looks like to identify it, right? If we can't, we have to be able to see the car, hear the car, go into past memory of what that car could look like, also make future projections about where it's going to go. So all these things start to happen and fire together so that we have a coherent vision of what's going on in the moment. Okay. So the other thing about this workspace is it's differentiated, but it needs to be integrated, right? So we need to be able to take that content and really isolate it, make sure we bring it in consciously into the workspace. Then we also need to make sure we're integrating that content to make a coherent whole. And this model, I think, can really start to help us understand how to process information in complex, uncertain, exponentially changing environments. It can help us understand how we can phase lock, like put all our energy and effort into mobilizing to create one future. We talked about the neural avalanche, like how do we go all or nothing in our responses in life. It also looks at how information can synchronize across the brain itself. That's not necessarily connected to create new ideas, but maybe even between individuals as well. Like I like to think that, within this content of the global workspace, you could think of it as having a team of people or one individual whose focus is on the values, one team or individual who's focused on what are we attentive to right now. So each person or each team could account for one area of content to ensure that we are getting the right content. It allows for fast adaptation. Right? So when we are able to access more content and information and ideas, we're able to adapt faster. Explains how we can, or how or why information starts to compete, right? So in situations where you have one set of content that's really dominating the situation, we have to understand the other pieces of content also want to be heard, to be understood. And I think the global workspace model can be used to enhance conscious executive control, to perform voluntary actions, achieve goals, and to harmonize time domain inconsistencies. Like, so when we have something that happened that seems a little bit disconnected from what's relevant in the moment, how do we understand that? Whether that be short-term or long-term. And on a short-term basis, for example, when audio or video track of a movie is not synchronized, think about how confusing that is, right? Have you ever watched a video like on YouTube where there's a delay in the sound and it feels so disruptive, even though it's such a small little disconnect, right? So what the brain actually does a lot of times in certain situations, it'll actually try to, even if it's not really happening, it'll try to harmonize those two inconsistencies. Okay. And the more content you can pull into this brain, the more you can harmonize the inconsistencies of a situation. So let's, so as an overall picture of how this could look like, calling it this kind of cognitive flow space as we build this cognitive architecture, is basically we prioritize and select different intelligence or different information, both top down and bottom up, so consciously or unconsciously. And we're also integrating that information consciously or unconsciously to create a future frame. And then that future frame is going to determine the types of strategies, innovation, what makes sense, what doesn't, what's possible in decision making. Okay. So if we go into a situation, let's say a facilitation, where we're going to develop a strategy or innovation or a foresight, and we don't take this understanding of the processing of the brain and really learn how to utilize it, we're going to develop a goal frame. It's going to happen. The brain's going to do it whether we're aware of it or not, right? And we're going to think that's the best goal frame because that's the one we got, right? So you don't really question it because you don't understand that there could be other better goal frames out there. So if you take the time to consciously input the right content, you're increasing the likelihood you're going to have a better dominant goal frame, not only for you as an individual, but also for your teams. Okay. So let me take questions. Is this making sense so far? And does anybody have any questions?
Well, did you just say then of the 3 steps that the emphasis is going back to number 1, because what you put in that forms the basis for 2 and 3 is really where your expansion or your change from a typical approach would be?
Yeah, I would say that's true. If you focus on trying to create the dominant goal frame, but don't understand how the content is being put into the brain, you're gonna miss something.
Sure.
But if you just feed the right content in, your brain's naturally going to create the dominant goal frame.
That's right.
That should be the best, right? It's like in my martial arts training, you focus on the small little steps to create the whole form. You don't focus on the form. If you focus on the form, you miss all the little steps that are important to get there, right? Or you even focus on the in-between spaces in the movement, what happens in between the steps. And then by doing that, you have the right movement. Right. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool. Anyone else have any questions so far? Okay, let's move on then to the next little part here. So, so what we were interested in doing at Haku is taking this idea and trying to figure out how do we make this a practical application, of the neuroscience for leaders, organizations. So we know we have this, neuroscience foundation that's saying there's these systems of the brain that are providing content that's going to create the dominant goal frame. And if you look at the systems, it makes a lot of sense. We have an intentional, let's go back to the beginning. We have a memory system, and this memory system is going to create the mental models right? Or even the biases that we might have. This fits a lot into issues with diversity and inclusion, right? That we might be considering right now. And that memory system, it's going to provide content from the past that's going to feed in. And I would say for most people, that is where a dominant amount of the information is coming from, just because that's how we've been trained, how we've trained our brain to work. And it's very efficient when we do that as well, because when we already have, preloaded memories or information and we just pull it back up and we can reproduce that, hey, that's great. That's efficient. That's a good use of your energy. In the present moment, we also have the perception system. So think of this system as one that is sensing not only what's going on in the body, but also things that are going on outside the body in the present moment, right? So, for example, we could check in for a moment. Let's all do that real quick. Let's just close our eyes for a second, and just take a deep inhale and an exhale. And all I want you to do is just kind of sense into your body and just notice what you notice. And also notice what you notice inside the body or even outside the body. What are you just what comes to your perception? Okay, then we can open our eyes. Who noticed something that they didn't notice before?
So I just had my vaccination shot a couple of days ago, and I noticed after exhaling that it was still kind of sore.
In the arm.
In the arm.
Yeah. Well, interesting. That's right. I mean, I think anybody else have anything they want to share?
I was aware of background noise in the room.
Yep.
That's just there, but I was more aware of it.
Mm-hmm. I noticed for myself, I'm a little more warm. I've got this room's just a little bit warmer than my other rooms, and I wasn't noticing that before. That's interesting. Anybody else?
I had a bit of a soreness in my back. I didn't notice it until I took a deep exhale. I was like, oh,
cool.
Okay. And so I
great.
changed my posture.
Yeah. So the idea is our brain is sensing, right? It's constantly trying to mainly maintain homeostasis, right? And constantly adapt to the micro changes that are happening in our body or outside the world. And it's taking energy, it's taking resources, it's taking attention to do that. And typically we're not aware of it. There was actually, I did a session for actually the Small Giants, they're one of their leadership training programs. And I did a session and I had everybody do that short, just, sensing their perception. What are they perceiving? And one guy noticed he was very hungry and we had just started the meeting, right? Now, what was interesting to him at the end of the meeting, he said, typically, if I was hungry, I would get really distracted and a little bit angry and frustrated. He said, but because I was aware that I was hungry, I didn't have that same reaction, right? So it just showed me that just bringing awareness to those things that are happening in the body that we're not aware of, all of a sudden diffuses them in some way, right? But also makes us more aware of how they're adding to this global workspace. So the perception is happening in the moment. We also have an intentional system. That is really, so one way to think about that is kind of like our focus, right? So although we have a lot of things going on, for example, maybe the pain in the back, how much attention are we giving it, right? So we can be aware of it and then not give it much attention. But what we start to give attention to is going to start to provide content. It's going to say this information is way more valuable. So we need to feed more of that into this workspace. And then we have values, right? And these can be values from our past. Like it can be our own sense of, what we think, who we think we are. Values are really important for continuity of change over time, right? So if I maintain my values as a person, I maintain my sense of self, right? I'm a person who values integrity. And if I maintain that integrity, oh, that's great. I know who I am. But if I keep shifting my values and change my values, that disrupts the continuity over time of the self. So values are being fed in there. A lot of times, though, we're not aware of our values, right? Or we're not aware of how we're operationalizing our values in our life or our business. And also the value system also relates to evaluation. Like how are we evaluating a situation, You know, what kind of methodologies are we using to say this is valuable for us or not? So this can be things like return on investment, KPIs, that we're feeding into this, right? Because we could create a future, but then say it doesn't really fit with our values as an organization from a KPI perspective. And then finally, we have anticipation systems. And this is really speaking to this idea of the future of foresight. And I think a lot of times when people are doing foresight work and looking into the future, this is what they're really focusing a lot on is what are we trying to anticipate? What scenarios are we developing? What are the trends and signals that are out there? And the way I like to think about this, though, is these are feeding into the workspace. They're not the end goal in a sense. So initially, at least, they're not the end goal. If I want to, what's going to happen 50 years in the future, I'm going to think into that future and I'm going to feed that content back into this workspace. And then that's going to mesh and integrate, compete with this other content. Then a dominant frame is going to emerge, right? And if I'm aware of that, then it creates a different perspective on that initial foresight work and the role it has within this context. We'd like to think of this maybe as a way to abbreviate a P2 F2V model. Okay. And what we'll look at is a traditional model of foresight would be a P2F, which would be your past, your present, and your future and how those relate. And what's unique about this model is it really adds in the focus and values and the role they have, right? I think it also helps to understand like why emotional intelligence is important for the future, why mindfulness and meditation is important for the future, right? Why being able to clearly share our values is important in the future, right? And also the role of mental models, of biases, and what we're even feeling in the moment. So it's a rich model, and also because that it could seem a little more complex than it needs to be. But we think this is the foundation, the basis of all foresight comes from these 5 places of content. And then we want to explore, well, what would that look like if that's true? And so a kind of a bigger picture of this, of how it could look, is that it's kind of the same model that we talked about with Bars and Dehaene, but a little more refined in that we have these attentional systems. They're feeding content into this workspace. And then from that, we are developing the dominant goal frame that's just emerging, right, in this complex, uncertain, exponentially changing environment. And then that goal frame is going to then help to frame the strategies, scenarios, sense making, design thinking, innovation, decisions that we want to make. Okay. So this idea is that we can start to create this dominant goal frame consciously and then bring that into strategy sessions, bring that into innovation sessions, or even integrate it into the whole process itself. Okay. And just being aware of this now too, is we can do this for ourselves as an individual, for our teams, or for our organization. And so what we're going to be exploring over the next 3 modules is what we call the 6 pillars of future intelligence, right? So our way of trying to simplify this model is say, look, there's these pillars out there that we really need to build our future intelligence around. They have their own kind of competencies, their own skill sets, also methodologies and tools, right? And then as you build those, you start to develop more future readiness, right? And I think the important thing about this idea of future readiness, because I know this is kind of a hot topic right now, and a lot of people are talking about it, is what does it mean to be future ready? And we say, well, it's really about creating that brain, right? Or that body, or that collective group of brains and bodies that are future ready. And so that they can meet any future that emerges, right? So it's not about being future ready about knowing what future is going to emerge, because we don't, right? But it's about being ready no matter what future emerges, and also being to shape the future no matter what future does emerge. Okay. And to do that, you need certain skill sets, you need certain tools. So in the next 3 modules, in the next module, we're going to do pillar 1. We're going to look at context. And context is really going to be about that inner context of the brain and body. And what are ways we can start to really optimize that so that we can start to get the best content, right? We really need to create the space for the right content to come in. And we're going to talk about how our physiology really does determine that. It impacts that a lot. In the 3rd module, we're going to look at, I should put module 4 here. In the 3rd module, we're going to look at the past, present, and also a little bit of future, and how that is really an understanding of traditional foresight and orientation to time. and why that's important, but also how that is kind of missing some key components as well. And then finally, we'll look at focus and values and future intelligence and how those fit into the model and how that creates this complete model, really grounded in the 6 pillars of future intelligence to help people and individuals, organizations be more future intelligent. Now, in the process, we want to also make it very practical too. So we start applying this information. And so we've developed what we call the Future Intelligent Design Canvas. So the idea here is it's a framework that allows you to start to input information in those, consciously input it into the different content pieces, context pieces, and then also start to develop an overall kind of perception, information or idea or framework or dominant goal frame for determining what's next. Okay. So we'll be using this throughout the training as well to start applying things. And the first task is going to be to think about what would you like to apply this design canvas or this information for? Was it something personal that you want to ask a question about or solve a challenge that you have? Or is it something for yourself as a leader or something for your business, right? So that'll be our first step that we work on is what's going to be my key question? What's my key challenge that I'm trying to solve? And then we'll be using that in the design canvas to answer it. So I do have resources I can send you a link for that'll allow you to dive deeper into this information. We also have an article coming out that I'll actually send you a pre-copy of. It's called the 6 Pillars of Future Intelligence. It's going to be published in a book on leadership. It's coming out later this year, I think in the next 3 to 4 months. And it just kind of talks about this framework of what future intelligence looks like, the neuroscience of it, and why there's 6 pillars of future intelligence. And then next module, we'll be looking at, again, the optimizing the inner context to shape the outer content, how that relates to foresight, strategy, and innovation. We'll be differentiating, integrating the mindsets and states for prospective thinking, strategic thinking, innovation thinking. So one idea here is that we need to feed the brain different content or be in different states to really be in the right place for strategy versus innovation versus foresight. There's different mindsets to be in. We'll also be looking at how you can optimize that inner context. And then we'll also be developing, how to develop contextual and goal-aligned awareness to ensure that we're continuously adapting, right? We're continuously being future ready in the moment. So we have a few more minutes here, and I'd like to get some feedback or questions from you. What were some of your key takeaways so far?
Tyler, I'll go back. I'll go back a few slides. So when you were looking at the sort of 3 pieces,
this one here.
Let's see.
Oh, this
no,
one.
I think that one.
Yep.
I know I already said it, but it seems to me that you're saying number 2 is by default. That's just what the brain does.
Yep.
So if you differentiate what you're doing from a typical either foresight program or leadership program, it's something to do with how you're handling number 1. Is that right? Okay.
Yes, and then from there, what are the methodologies and frameworks that would really foster the right optimizing that first step?
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the idea is that, like we said, if you get the right, it's almost like if you get the right building blocks, the brain automatically builds the right building.
Right.
But we tend to focus on how do I build the building? And the idea is we're saying, no, get the building blocks right. The brain will just build the right building with it. It just knows how to do it automatically, unconsciously.
Okay.
I don't know, and Adam might be able to say more about that too.
Okay.
I could say some things on that, but one comment I want to make is I've been studying these things for a while, and frankly, what you're describing is more sophisticated than anything I've heard from Bars or DeHane. It's actually in some ways going more to the fundamental principles and generalizing the workspace based on what it's actually doing. But it's also contextualizing it in its necessary embodied value-driven context as this unfolding process. I've actually never seen anything like it. I don't know how you did it. So
Thanks.
that's a comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Yeah, I think the key will be, really translating into practical application, right? Over the next 3 modules is, do we do that in the right way, and do people get it and make it can apply it, right? Because if it's just theory, it's not helpful, really. That's what I've always loved about working with executive teams in a business environment is you have to get results. You can have the best ideas in the world, but if it doesn't get results, it's worthless.
I could speculate.
Yeah.
I actually think I wonder whether like part of the way you did it is actually like your like martial arts type practices and way of being. Like you're actually introspecting. Like a lot of like cognitive scientists don't actually do that. And so I think they actually will miss certain things. They're actually like, I think like global workspace theory is like, right. It's like a really good model.
Yep.
But like, you're not going to see the actual thing that's driving this engine for like moving us into the future by analogy to the past. Like you're not going to see that unless you like give it this this contextualization in like an embodied, embedded, and active kind of way. And so it seems like that, I don't know, maybe that's the secret sauce. It's like, no.
Well, it's interesting too. I do think a lot about how we are moving into a more, just more and more heavily digital world, technology driven world. And from leadership perspective, I think that the leaders are going to emerge, the ones who can really connect back, right, into them brain, their own body. They're going to be so unique, like these diamonds in the rough almost, because how are they able to do that and manage that within this heavily tech digital world and space? And many people are going to possibly lose that connection over time, or they're going to augment it, in many ways, and then lose it because of that. They're not going to know how to get back to it. Any other thoughts from anyone they want to share?
Yeah, Tyler, thank you for that. I'm really looking forward to sort of going deeper into the how and the process. But this really connects with what I've been studying lately with the work of Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's just written a book about the brain. And it helps me with my coaching, actually, when we talk about emotional intelligence and collective intelligence, and how emotions actually kind of manifest. And she's just clarified this whole thing about the brain's most important work is body budgeting, allostasis and predicting how much, adrenaline and dopamine and so on our body needs to survive the next period, right? And so what came to my mind when you were speaking about developing the brain and the body to be future ready is similar to her message in that because we're actually always almost predicting from the past. For example, if you see a facial expression where we're already predicting what that people might be feeling, her advice is to actually, expand our repertoire of emotional experiences, sort of enriching our emotional granularity so that when we come across these contexts, we are better able to predict better. And that's how I'm connecting what you're saying with what I'm learning right now.
I think that's a great way to think about it, right? Is that a lot of people have limited content, right, for how they're deciding, how the emotional response that this person's having, or the context of this emotional response. I know for myself, having traveled a lot around the world, right, you interact with a lot of different cultures, and you start to get a lot of different reference points, right? So you'll have a lot of different content that I feed in, based on the situation, and some of it conflicts, right? Because in one culture they might do something that conflicts with another culture, right? And the same expression or the same context, but a different result or meaning. But once you have the context, once you have that content to feed in, right? So I think you're right. It's like the more leadership can learn how to access that new content in conscious ways, then the better they can create the right goal frames for themselves and their organization. Anyone else have any insights?
I hadn't really thought about it that much, but as you were going through all your slides and when you bumped into the 6 pillars, for me, the values piece really stuck out, and it sort of tied very closely into norms and rewards. What do we reward people for as they move through the executive chain and the leadership molds and that sort of thing, and how much values will drive what future you see. I mean, your value will jump to the future because you'll try to build a more or better value place for your values to live. And if your values are the ones that we're trying to destabilize, we're going to that'll be the major task of the 6 pillars is to decenter, destabilize, to interrogate your own values. Yep. It was just an observation. I hadn't really given them much thought before until I was listening to you to speak there.
Yeah, I think as you're saying that too, what comes to mind is how this is all integrated too. So if you are, if you're someone who's worked your way up the corporate ladder, and the value structure has been, achieving short-term goals and making lots of profit, that's your value metric. Then over time, you feed that now into your memory metric as well, right? The memory content. So that's now feeding in, and the value system is validating that too. And those start to really dominate then the future framing. Like, how do I create more futures where, I can make lots of profit in the short term, and you're rewarded for it. Yeah, and that becomes the dominant goal frame from which you see the whole goal of your organization, and then all futures are built around that. And then you neglect the other parts. Who else? Any other insights?
I think just one tidbit for me was the slide where you showed the different levels of intelligence, right? You start off with intelligence, just basic knowledge, and then you build your way up, emotional, collective, and then future. I think that's really important. And going back to what Adam said, context, right? In order to really go up those levels, you need to learn the context of each situation and how to respond to them accordingly. And then you learn content from that, which then allows you to make further associations to then build on the collective intelligence of not just yourself, but that of others, of other cultures, of other races. And then from that, be able to build a future intelligence, which allows you to depict a future or have foresight and innovate as a result, right? And if your metric is make profit, then you're pretty good at that. You know what you need to do. If your metric is develop my team to be better people, to be better engineers or scientists or whatever it may be, or salespeople, then you have that metric and you know how to achieve it easily because you're harnessing those things. I think bringing light to this is important, right? I think a lot of people do it subconsciously, but not a lot of people do it consciously. And if we can get more people to do it consciously, I think it benefits all of us as a society and building a better future together.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and it's interesting too. I think going back to some of that research around episodic memory and episodic foresight, and they showed that people can have great memories, they can have lots of information. So they could be very cognitively intelligent, but actually poor at building episodic foresight or episodic futures, right? And I think what's interesting too is we've tend to in the past is reward cognitive intelligence, right? Sure. Can you pass this test, right? Okay, then you're the leader now. But then I think what this model shows, and it says, look, someone who just is values based and doesn't have much cognitive intelligence, their piece of the content's just as important, right? Because the brain is going to try to find that anyways. It's looking for that, whether they're aware of it or not.
And how do you think everyone can learn how to do that? Or is it just more the people that are more sensitive or empathic or?
Well, I think everybody can. I think there's going to be challenges for some people just because of maybe just how their brains work, right? But brains can change. We know that. And I think part of it is also giving it a framework. right? So I think what's been interesting to me is especially as, for example, mindfulness has been a growing interest in, say, corporate space. As you go and you do, I don't know if you've done any Hilde at Visa, right? But maybe you do like a 2-hour workshop on something, mindfulness or meditation, and that's it. There's no like saying like this is part of a framework. This is part of an integrated whole. There's no like, here's how we're going to start to apply it within the workspace. So I think what this model can do is it can say, look, this is, here's your mindfulness training. Here's how it fits into a framework that's based on how the brain works and why it's important. And then here's how we can start to apply it. Yeah. So I think part of it will be like, I think to your question is part of it will be having a solid framework. For leaders to adopt new practices and ideas, they need to be able to explain it to others and they need to understand it. And if you just, I think one of the problems with certain things is they're just like, well, how does it really work? What's the framework? What's the model? And if I don't have that, I can't do anything with it. So so what we're trying to do is create that model.
Thank
Cindy?
you.
Yeah, I was thinking about the same thing as I was thinking about, strengths finders. There are some people who are very futuristic and others who are not, or, there's some people that lean into this mindfulness and like understanding how the brain works. And other people are like, I don't want that, that's too much for me. So it's almost like, how do you do a pre-assessment of the organization that you're working with or the team that you're working with so that you can structure the delivery of it to appeal to them? So as I look at the cognitive architecture, you can easily apply that to a business and say, and just keep it very much in the business professional world and deliver it in a way that you'll get buy-in from the audience because they don't realize that they can self-apply these same things and grow as people too.
Right.
And then your other approach could be more towards those people who want to grow personally and how do I take this and change?
Agree. Yeah. So a lot of when I first started doing work, for example, working with Rolls-Royce, and they didn't bring me in to do mindfulness training. They wanted to solve a problem, right? They wanted to do foresight, or they wanted to find new innovation, and so I had to take these ideas and concepts, but to put them in a framework that got a result, right? And so they developed personally, even in a short one-day experience, but they also got the result they wanted to. And I think that's a really, beautiful thing, right? When you can have personal development and business development all working together. Okay, well, that wraps up the time today. And I want to thank you all for being here and taking your time. Really appreciate the feedback and your attention. And looking forward to seeing you in the next module next week.
Good. Thanks,
everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.